Now, there is a new Netflix documentary on Netflix at the moment called Take Your Pills. Have you watched it? Now, this documentary aims to look at the prevalence of medication that looks to focus the brain. So it's been used in people with like ADHD under the brand names of like Ritalin, Adderall, etc., but also kind of widens the scope on the broader kind of mind-enhancing nutrients that might be overall classified as nootropics. Now, the focus for much of this conversation was around these prescription drugs for things like ADHD, and the big focus of the documentary was Adderall. Now, what I found really interesting is they looked at the whole of the history of these drugs going all through the ages, looking at different methamphetamine usage, and I found that quite fascinating because I think knowing why we do this and how it's come about is actually really important. Like, why are people taking these drugs? Essentially, people are taking compounds like this to try and improve their mental performance. People are saying to themselves, if I can do more and get more out of my brain, my career, then isn't that a good thing? And what was interesting is the documentary wasn't really for or against the use of the drugs. It kind of just outlined the facts, said this is what some people are experiencing using it. Then they did a lot of case studies with parents that have got their kids using the drug, and that seemed to be life-changing for some families. Now, I think one of the really interesting conversations here is, what should we be doing when we are confronted with a child that has a learning difficulty or has ADHD or has something inherently going wrong with their kind of ability to learn and process information? Should it be a drug that provides the solution? Now, it seems in some cases 100%, like ADHD is a medical condition, the drugs have been shown to show improvement, and I've heard many conversations of parents that have said, you know what, using these drugs has really helped my child and it's been a bit of a godsend. Now, on the flip side of that, we could argue that maybe there's a big percentage of cases that needs more time and education. So above me is a load of cookbooks. Should we be teaching kids about food, learning about their environment, about learning and processing information, giving them tasks and skills? And, you know, almost, I found this amazing. This was framed by a parent and a teacher. He taught his one of his class students how to treat his ADHD like a superpower. Like no one else had it. It allowed him to think differently and creatively, and that actually empowered him. So are we doing more with people that learn differently and think differently to enable them to actually get the most out of how they think as people, rather than just classifying them, saying you've got ADHD, take this drug? Now, as someone that's into helping other people realize the potential and the options on the table, I'd like to think that education and time invested in that individual is always the first port of call. You know, if we've got someone young and they're struggling to learn, they're struggling to fit in, they think differently, what can we do to help that child? You know, rather than just forcing them into the current mold in any way, can we start to adapt the environment, how they learn, how they think and process information themselves, to help them learn and fit into the world that we see it today? And that's sometimes the big problem with the world that we live in today. We don't maybe have enough people willing to invest the time in others to help them work out their issues and how to really progress as an individual. Like, I think a certain way. Some people would walk into my environment and think, oh, this guy's mental. And, you know, I had many tests when I was at university for ADHD, and I got lots of support and training to learn how to educate myself properly in a way that was conductive for me. And I think the only reason I was successful with that is I took time to learn about how my brain worked. I got attention and help from university services, and really that was never picked up at school. No one ever really took attention there. I had to take it upon myself to say, well, you know, I think maybe a bit differently to a lot of other people. How am I going to get help with this? Now, the other really interesting conversation in the program was about people taking these substances to help improve their brain power. Really popular in high pressure environments, you know, think Silicon Valley, New York, stock markets, people trying to get the most out of their brain. And it was interesting, there was only really one downside where I think an individual said that the processing of nutrients through his liver was compromised at the time. Now, whether that was because of the drug, no one really knows. And they never really talked about any other symptoms apart from addiction. And this is the problem, probably, or the conversation that most of us should be having with these kind of compounds. And it could be anything, any drugs, alcohol, anything that someone can become dependent on, really, do we have to raise the drug or the compound as the problem, or the individual that is looking at using that to feel better about themselves? Because ultimately, if that is the case, it's not actually the compound that's the problem, it's the environment that someone lives in every day. Like, why do they need to be dependent on that? Why are they struggling to be happy? Why are they struggling to potentially fit in? Do they struggle with their passion, their work? Do they just struggle with their emotions and their thought process any day? Like, alcohol's a really popular one. People use it to wind down, relax. Like, is it healthy to always need that to wind down? So I think the addiction part of the conversation is really important. And I'm not going to sit here and say I'm qualified by any means to talk about this. But, you know, I've gone through periods in my life where I've used alcohol, maybe more than I should have. I've, you know, used other things more than I should have to maybe force myself or be more comfortable with an environment that I'm currently in. Now, luckily, I feel I'm a very self-aware person, and I've kind of stood back and reassessed that. Or maybe I use something short-term. I remember relying even just on caffeine a lot more when I was feeling burnt out more recently, wasn't getting enough sleep, wasn't getting enough rest and downtime, and caffeine is an upper. And I was definitely using alcohol a little bit more as a downer. So we've got to, as people, stand back and assess these environments and say, okay, is the way that I'm using this compound or drug or system, is it healthy for me right now? Is this a short-term or a long-term solution? And if it's a long-term solution, we're going to become addicted to it, and that's when we need to ask why. So I know this is quite a bit of rambling about this program, and I'm really interested to hear what other people think of the program, because I thought it was fascinating, but I was a little bit upset there wasn't more talk about, you know, maybe some of the symptoms or the problems, because, you know, quite often these programs can become really effective to be anti-drugs when they really highlight the problems. And actually, I don't think there's a lot of research to date, and I've had a look around of the real negatives of these drugs. And I mean, not opinion-led research, I mean actual, you know, double-blind placebo trials where we're looking at people that are taking the drugs, people that aren't, and the effects on the upside. Now, I think you've also got to look at the broader context of when we look at individuals that are relying on compounds, alcohol, drugs, etc., broad classification, what their other lifestyle habits are. Like, there's so many people that rely on something or have unhealthy habits that are tied into other unhealthy habits. So others or individuals that might have a drug addiction might also rely on alcohol. They might be highly stressed. They might not sleep enough. They might not get enough fruits and vegetables. And actually, when you compound all this stuff, it does lead to a lot of problems. But if you take an individual that is maybe really healthy, really balanced, sleeps really well, and maybe does one or two things compound-wise here and there, is that an unhealthy thing? I'm just playing devil's advocate. I think there's different levels of where different things can fit into people's lifestyles, and obviously everyone's going to have their own interpretation of whether something is healthy or not. But I'm going to stop there, and I'm just interested to hear what other people's opinions are. Have you watched Netflix documentary Take Your Pills? Do you have experience with addiction? Do you have experience with these drugs? Do you have experience with other drugs or compounds? I'm just here to have a conversation. I think it's fascinating, and I think reviewing these programs helps create conversation, and in conversation comes realization and thought, and it allows people to think objectively about these kind of things, and I think that's cool. So yeah, let me know what you think.